So in this segment, we're going to talk about my kind of confusion around Labour and their Brexit. Once again, it's kind of what do they expect to get out of this kind of review of the trade and cooperation agreement? Because it's not a renegotiation, as some people keep trying to say. It's a review, which could easily mean the EU or the UK say, yeah, we're fine with the way things are. There are certain things that will have to be discussed. I think fishing is one of them, but that's a small piece of the overall puzzle here. So, this from Krishna, his questioning, he's generally quite good, but, his questioning here is a bit stupid. So we'll cut to the clip.
Our joint and strong view is that the key to this is growth. But wouldn't the single most...
And typically Labour kind of going down the Liz Truss route of our growth, we need growth. It's like, just because the economy grows does not mean that people get the benefits of it. I know they have listed on ways to get more regional growth and things like that, which is fine, but growth isn't just the answer here. You need redistribution as well as growth. We've had growth over the last 13 years. It's been low, but it's fairly comparable, I think, to other G7 countries. The only difference is those countries have had way more better redistribution of wealth than we have. So, you could replace Liz Truss here, not with Krishnan, but with Starmer or Reeves, and it would sound the same, except for it be a bit more coherent.
Most effective way to improve growth in Britain would be to look at rejoining the single market. And you've said...
And obviously we can't do that. And, I get bored of journalists failing to kind of understand this or use this as some sort of intellectual debate point is we can't rejoin the single market. Just stop saying it.
But again today, there is no case. Now, no case is a very strong thing to say, and it's difficult to believe that you really think that. No case means under no circumstances, never. It's not really what you're saying.
We've had low growth for 13 years. So the argument that this is all down to Brexit just doesn't wash.
It's not all down to Brexit, to be fair, but I think we'll see a much bigger drag on the British economy thanks to Brexit, because we only really left the EU in about the year 2021, I believe. We fully left the single market and the customs union. So this argument of, well, we've had low growth over the last 13 years is like, yes, that is down to the Tories, but I think the next decade, the growth will be capped because of the fact that we've lost our largest trading partner. That's problematic.
Used a very absolute phrase, which is there is no case. That means never. Is that really what
There's no case for going back into the EU. We've had a referendum. The country has decided. We've been through a huge period of uncertainty as a result, and there's no case for going back. But that does not mean that we have any less ambition on growth. It does not mean that we haven't got a very strong growth plan.
We have. Where is this growth plan? Where is the plan? I would love to see it. I would love for the IFS and the OBR to go through it, because genuinely I want to see what this plan is. We have not seen the plan. Not really. You've only told us some of the things you're not willing to do, and you're pulling back on things that you said you would do. So where is this plan?
The frustration is that, the longer it takes before we have a general election, the more we have the hallmark of this government, which is chop, change your mind, stop, start. Rachel's had 4 chancellors to shadow. I've had 3 prime ministers. This is the definition of the failure of the last few years.
And it's fine to transition that into a point, but it doesn't. This whole thing doesn't make sense. I think Krishnam's asking these questions more from an emotional point of view of what he wants kind of Labour to do or where he wants the country to be. It feels like maybe I'm wrong on that, but Labour's answers again. We've had low growth over the last 13 years, saying it's not because of Brexit, it's because of the Tories, which he's not 100% wrong on. But I think the next few years we'll see a very stagnant British economy. This is something we kind of have to jump around a bit. So Starmer made this comment in Canada, this on the 21st, which I found quite interesting.
Most of the conflict with the UK being outside of the UK...
And he misspoke here. He meant to say the UK being outside the EU, but I'm not going to grill him for that.
...arises insofar as the UK wants to diverge and do different things to the rest of our EU partners. Obviously, the more we share values, the more we share a future together, the less the conflict. And actually, different ways of solving problems become available. Actually, we don't want to diverge. We don't want to lower standards. We don't want to rip up environmental standards, working standards for people at work, food standards, and all the rest of it. So suddenly you're in a space where, notwithstanding the obvious fact that we are outside of the EU and not in the EEA, there's a lot more common ground than you might think.
So, he's not wrong. There is common ground. Obviously, the Conservatives committed to a level playing field, which they have reneged on. But the problem is that even if we don't diverge from the EU, we are still diverging from the EU in the sense of they will change rules. And we'll discuss that in a minute. But I did want to discuss, Labour kind of spokespeople coming out and saying that Starmer's remarks were limited to the areas of food, environmental, and labour standards, which are, I think, the things that really Starmer mentioned there. A spokesperson added it would not support the process known as dynamic alignment, under which the UK would pledge to maintain similar laws to the EU in a number of areas. And the issue is that Starmer has promised to get us a veterinary agreement. The issue is that what kind of veterinary agreement are you going to get? Labour would look to eliminate most border checks created by the Tory Brexit with a new veterinary agreement. This is something they published a while ago, but the EU have been very clear they're not going to give us an equivalency deal. We need to go for an alignment deal. So the question is, what are Labour actually promising here? And I know people are going to use the argument, oh, it's a negotiation, you don't know what either side is going to say, but the EU have been adamant here. If anything, for the most part, the EU's positions have barely changed. Even around things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, the EU's position hasn't really changed much. It's just a question of, they said we need the data. Once we get the data, we can figure things out a bit better from there. This seems to be Labour's stance on the situation.
And do you have evidence to suggest the EU would be willing to give us what you call a better deal?
Well, look, the EU is pretty annoyed with the British government, and
but that's not about the trade and cooperation agreement. They actually say that's a very good agreement as it is now.
Well, they would say that because they got a better deal than we did under Boris Johnson's deal of services, for example.
So they're not going to be up really for changing it in a few years.
Services aren't really covered for the most part in trade and cooperation agreement free trade agreements. You do get some service add-ons, but typically it's around goods.
Are they?
Well, we've got to reset the relationship with Europe because of the way the Conservatives have handled that relationship. That's why Keir Starmer was with President Macron only last week in Paris, because we have to show that as a country outside of the European Union, and let me be clear, Labour is not rejoining the European Union. Labour's not going to let the country rejoin the European Union, in the next Parliament. We've got to have a better
What if the country wants to rejoin rejoin the EU? Are you going to say Labour are going to stop the will of the people if that was the case? I mean, it's a bit clumsy from this dude here, and it seems like they've kind of fed him certain talking points and his brain's trying to reset back into him.
Relationship in the interest of the European economy, where we can add value as the UK, and in the interest of the UK economy.
And what would you...
And that's a fair point. And that's looking for mutual areas of where both sides can benefit. And I think that's a smart point to make.
Be willing to accept in return, then, what for that closer relationship? Because you won't get it for nothing, will you?
Well, there are some things that are in our kind of mutual interest. For example, many European member states are interested in our capacity to produce hydrogen for our electricity interconnectors, for the work we might be able to do on offshore wind turbines in the North Sea. When I go to Brussels, which I have done a lot in my previous roles, there are lots of European countries that want to work with the UK on projects of mutual interest. But because of the relationship...
aim to offshore wind and hydrogen, they're not the most dramatic things that are going to generate, tons of money here. If anything, I wouldn't be surprised if the EU wanted to be the ones who supplied us with most of the wind turbines and stuff like that, so it'd benefit their own manufacturing sectors, which there's nothing wrong for them to want something like that anyways. You've got this dude here, talking about, we're not going to bother playing the clip, but he just says we have no interest in watering or weakening or watering down UK standards. We're absolutely clear on our red lines and not going back into the EU, single market, customs union, or freedom of movement. Now, it's funny he singled out freedom of movement there. It's very clear who he's trying to appeal to. He says we would seek to secure an improved trading relationship with the EU. So what we can gather is that the Labour Party won't do stuff like allowing pesticides that are banned within the EU. Labour probably won't do this sort of stuff. But the issue is that, are we going to see more convergence? Because, again, the EU acts to cut arsenic levels in baby food. And these are the kinds of examples that, are going to be more and more important. Are the Labour Party going to look to converge with the EU on certain rulings here? Because we already know businesses, for the most part, especially the ones that export the bigger ones, these are the ones that make baby food, have said that they're going to match what the new EU levels are, regardless of if the stuff's manufactured off in Great Britain or not. So these are the questions Labour really needs to ask themselves here. And, Starmer talked more recently about, beneficial alignment, differing from dynamic alignment, that the idea that the UK would follow evolving EU rules in an indefinite area, which Labour is at pains to stress it does not support. So the question is, how many areas of kind of mutual beneficial alignment will we find, and will the EU allow this? Because this feels very much like cherry picking, and in certain areas where it's more beneficial to the EU, maybe they'll accept it. And this kind of stuff, it does make some sense to kind of frame it in this way. We will look for beneficial alignment, but I just can't see the EU doing it, especially when we are in competition with the EU. Let's not forget that. When it comes to trade, would the EU make things too beneficial for us, or kind of look to improve things for us when certain member states might be thinking, do you know what, we could set up facilities that do this stuff and we could benefit from it instead of allowing a third country to benefit. So it is a bit strange here. You've got this from Anton Spivak, saying Labour comms got a bit too ahead of itself, ruling out dynamic alignment. The risk is incoherence, claiming that they would want, e.g. a veterinary agreement with the EU, and prematurely closing that door, which would lead to one. And the issue, even with the equivalency deal, right, you're still going to have to up your standards to an extent when the EU ups their standards. So, for example, if the EU dramatically updates their health standards to be a lot better, right, for animals, and say a country like New Zealand doesn't, New Zealand would be at risk of losing its equivalency status with the EU. So, the idea that we wouldn't kind of align as closely as we could, despite it not being in a formal agreement, I'm not sure about. But the comms people are pretty clear on this. This is messages to Sam Coates, who works for Sky. A Labour Party spokesman said, quote, "We've left the European Union and we're not going back in any form. We don't support dynamic alignment. We're not joining the single market or the customs union. We will not be in a situation where we are a rule taker. Any decisions on what standards we follow will be made in the UK Parliament. The Tories have not used Brexit to diverge on food, environmental or labour standards, and if they have a plan to do so, they should come clean with people," end quote. And that's capped because the Tories have used Brexit to diverge on food standards, as we've just kind of established with these pesticides. That's not even true. So this spokesperson has no idea, absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And what they're saying is, if the Tories want to diverge, they should say so. But they already are planning to do so anyways because of the Brexit bonfire thing. Like, what's it called? Rees-Mogg was going to take us back into the 80s based on what his bill was trying to do, the EU retention bill. So this is a nonsense statement from whoever this person is. But if we go back to we don't support dynamic alignment, we will not be a rule taker. We are a rule taker. As many people pointed out, if we want to export to the EU, we have to accept their rules. So this point doesn't make any sense. Whenever you want to export to a country, you follow their rules. So if they have higher standards than yours, you meet those higher standards, or your stuff's going to get returned by customs. So it doesn't make sense. And so some of this stuff is fine, talking about beneficial alignment, all of this stuff. But the question is, what are the EU going to accept? And I don't know. And Labour kind of transitioning from Labour kind of saying we're going to get a veterinary agreement. And I think the more they're pushed on these things, the more difficult it's becoming for them to really come out with a coherent point. Starmer talking about most of the problems that we're having with the EU revolve around divergence, which is true. He is right on that. Partly, for the most part of it's culture war nonsense stuff, like channel crossings and things. But for the most part, the issues around goods could be resolved if we had more convergence with the EU. The question is, are the Labour Party going to do that? Because it's not the clearest. Now, businesses have praised Labour for taking this stance. So, maybe Labour will back where the money is. But there's going to be more and more questions, especially as the EU keeps kind of changing their rules and kind of evolving their rules, is how much are Labour going to meet those new rules if Labour are elected, and where will they draw the line? That's what I'd be interested to see, because I think it is a bit incoherent, some of the stuff they are saying, beneficial alignment, but given, the EU rules are kind of the base rules, they set the floor, the minimum, not the maximum. Surely we would want higher rules than them anyways, and maybe that's something Labour should be pushing more, that we would have higher rules than the EU because the EU set the floor rather than the ceiling for the most part. I don't know. It just feels like they're desperate to say we're not joining the single market and all of these kind of things, without saying what kind of areas would they look for more cooperation. I think that's where the incoherence kind of for me appears, because they talk about what they won't do. They talk about the things they won't do, but they don't talk about the things that they will do. That's the issue, and I think that's something we should be discussing more. I think if Labour come out, and I know they've spoken about the rivers and things like that, the pollution, that's fine, but I don't know. For me, I still think they're lacking in certain areas. I think getting formal agreements is better. Getting the amount of paperwork and things like that cut down is better as much as possible, especially for exporters. But I don't know if this lot will be the ones to achieve it, because it looks like they fear the optics of it rather than the results. I think maybe if they push to farmers or, you know, people that work in agriculture and fishing and things like that to say, like, you know, we're willing to do these things, would you publicly come out and back us? This will actually help your industry rather than your stuff suffering with endless paperwork. I don't know. So I'm at risk of rambling a bit here, but it is a bit incoherent what Labour are saying here. The question is, where do they draw the line on convergence, I guess? Where do they say, what are the beneficial areas? Because Labour have been really weird on kind of being close to EU rules, you know, around services, around agriculture, around everything, really. So I'm interested to see what they're actually planning here. And I do hope journalists come out and ask better questions than, oh, look, why don't you just join the single market? Like, come on, Krishnan, bruv. Like, I would hope you're better than that, I'll be honest. But, you know, like I said, the level of journalism in this country is on the floor. That's why people on YouTube look better than people who've been doing this for a couple of decades now. Bro's been doing this since I was a kid, I think. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Sorry I've rambled quite a bit in this video. Hopefully it makes sense. This is not criticism for the sake of it, but I am kind of confused by what Labour are trying to do here. But, yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.